Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. First, let me introduce myself. I'm Dr. Jen Rogers. I'm the Director of Statistical Consultancy at the University of Oxford, and I'm the Royal Statistical Society's Vice President for External Affairs. Secondly, let me welcome you here on behalf of the RSS and the Nuffield Foundation for this evening's lecture by our very distinguished speaker, the Right Honourable Alan Milburn. As you know, Alan will be reflecting on the Beveridge Report 75 years after its publication, and its aim of slaying what Beveridge himself had the audacity and the eloquence to call the 5 giants on the road to reconstruction. What a great phrase. Personally, I love both the extraordinary scale of Beveridge's ambition and the brutal simplicity of the language that he used. In an age where we're all supposed to tread gently with our choice of words, I'm a big fan of those used by Beveridge in his report. For he wasn't someone who set out to tackle what we might now call relative deprivation, educational underachievement, lower life expectancy, suboptimal housing, or underemployment. He spoke instead of slaying want, ignorance, disease, squalor, and idleness. 5 truly giant problems. And he battled them with the best evidence, the best ideas, and I'm very proud to say, the best statistics that he could muster. Indeed, I'm particularly proud of one other fact too. For if you look over to your right, there is a list of past presidents at the RSS. And as you'll see, Sir William Beveridge just happened to be RSS president when he produced his landmark report. Now, I must admit that it's beyond me how you could ever fulfill all your duties as vice president, let alone president, of a very active, learned society, and as a sideline, lay the foundations for the National Health Service, the modern-day social security system, and the rest of the post-war welfare state. But somehow, miraculously, it was something that William Beveridge, our then president, managed to do. Maybe he'd had the right assistants, because when he wanted to amass all the evidence on which one of his earlier reports was based, Beveridge decided to draw on the services of a young man who would also, years later, become an RSS president. It was someone with whom, in fact, Beveridge didn't get on particularly well with, someone who was then tipped for a career in academia rather than politics, and someone who was then known as a liberal rather than a Labour figure, but one who was hindered by his apparently limited political skills. Yet that someone went on to be not an academic, not a liberal, and not an inconsequential politician, but a Labour Prime Minister not once, but twice, a certain Harold Wilson. Wilson, of course, had his own way with words, from the pound in your pocket to the white heat of the scientific revolution, and a week is a long time in politics. That one aside, so less impressively so, I noticed, ever the statistician, that Wilson once said his government wanted every worker in the country to have a greater than average income. That one aside, Wilson could undoubtedly come up with some great political quotes, but none of his rhetoric, I think, ever matched Beveridge's less polished but infinitely more important pledges to slay the 5 giants identified in his report, published 75 years ago, almost to the day. It was a pivotal moment in Britain's 20th century history, so I'm delighted that so many of you have joined us here today to help mark it here at the RSS. On behalf of the Society, it is my privilege to welcome you all to Errol Street this evening. And now it is my great pleasure to hand over to Tim Gardam from our event partners, who will also say a few words about Beveridge, his report, and the scale of his accomplishment before he formally introduces our very distinguished speaker tonight, whose lecture we are all looking forward to immensely. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for listening. Now please welcome Tim Gardam, Chief Executive of the Nuffield Foundation.
Jen, thank you very much. The Nuffield Foundation is delighted to support this evening's event. The work of the Social Mobility Commission and Alan Milburn's lecture tonight go to the heart of the Foundation's overarching purpose, the advancement of social well-being, that was enshrined in our original trust deed in May 1943, just 6 months after the publication of the Beveridge Report. And the Royal Statistical Society has always had a close intellectual affinity to Nuffield, and especially in recent months, thanks to Heaton Shah, has been a much valued partner and source of advice and encouragement. The post-war world that Beveridge sought to frame in his report is itself now slipping out of living memory, even though its resonances still shape much of political debate. The social and economic structures and technological parameters that shape our life chances today would be almost unrecognisable to those who queued to read the report on publication. So the Beveridge Report is, for the Nuffield Foundation, both a key point of reference and a challenge. How can we support and stimulate the thinking necessary to confront the current giants that a contemporary Beveridge would wish to slay? So by way of introduction to Alan Milburn's lecture, let me offer some brief historical background. William Beveridge and William Morris, Lord Nuffield, are both giant figures in the history of Britain in the first half of the 20th century. Born within 2 years of each other in the late 1870s, they died 6 months apart in 1963. And the legacies of both have remained into the 21st century. Beveridge, thanks to one out of his many reports, Social Insurance and Allied Services, which immediately took on his name and has become the byword for the welfare state. Nuffield's name remains not as one of Britain's great industrial entrepreneurs, though he was certainly that, but as the greatest British philanthropist of his age, larger in the fields of medicine and science. At first sight, they appear utterly different. One, the director of the LSE, professional public servant, and academic social scientist. The other, the mechanical engineer and industrialist, with a workbench in his bedroom all his life, with a love-hate relationship with the academy on account of being born in the shadow of Jude the Obscure's Victorian Oxford. He wrote little down and had little to say in public. As exemplars of social mobility, the contrasts are as stark. Beveridge, son of an Indian civil servant, born in the Raj, gained his double first in mathematics and classics at Balliol College, Oxford, at exactly the same time as 800 yards away down the road in James Street off Iffley Road, in a terraced workman's cottage, Nuffield was establishing his first bicycle workshop business in his parents' garden shed. Yet, for all their differences, both were in many ways late Victorians, with a personal austerity and implacable belief in the virtues of self-reliance and personal industry. Their politics were entirely different. Beveridge, the Liberal, with a mutual dislike of Neville Chamberlain's government, becomes associated with the greatest reforms of the 1945 Labour government through his conception of his conception of national insurance reflects his intellectual roots in Gladstonian liberalism. Nuffield was no liberal, and you can say that again. He had been attracted initially by Mosley's new party platform for a planned economy. Nuffield was a great supporter of the Chamberlain government, not least because of Chamberlain's record in reforming public health and affordable housing, but Nuffield also had an industrialist's abhorrence of socialism. By 1939, Nuffield had already given away £25 million, about 1.2 billion today. In 1936, he had established the Nuffield Trust for the Special Areas, a social investment fund to intervene in areas of highest unemployment. The government had put aside 7 million. Nuffield contributed 2 million of his own. So it's interesting that barely 6 months after the Beveridge Report set out to slay the 5 giants of squalor, ignorance, want, idleness and disease, Nuffield drew up a trust deed that put his remaining personal holding of 42% of the shares of Morris Motors into a foundation, £10 million. It was for the advancement of health and the prevention and relief of sickness, the advancement of social well-being by scientific research, and the improvement of technical and commercial education, including the training of teachers, the care and comfort of the aging poor, the relief of the disabled, and the relief of children suffering from mental or other handicap. The Nuffield Foundation trust deed is in some senses, I think, a statement of the voluntarist defiance against the collective tide of opinion already in full flow towards a welfare state. It begins with a flourish. Whereas Lord Nuffield, believing that those individual resources which can only be built up by private enterprise and which are freely given in the service of the community are a vital factor in the growth of Commonwealth, and on it goes. In one sense, Beveridge's vision of the welfare state could be seen to supersede that voluntarist impulse of Nuffield's charitable interventions, though in another both represent common concern for workable methods to deliver social well-being. Beveridge, after all, was not a man to doubt his own contribution. As he modestly told his research assistant, the young Harold Wilson, "This is the greatest advance in our history. There can be no turning back. From now on, Beveridge is not the name of a man, it is the name of a way of life, and not only for Britain, but for the whole of the civilized world." Nuffield, however, for all his professed horror of socialism, seems to have made a shrewd assumption that as the state increasingly took over the funding of scientific research and the oversight of social affairs, so would there be a greater need for alternative funding if the plurality of independent research was to be maintained. And the increasing significance in the 21st century of those three great charitable trusts, Nuffield, Wellcome and Leverhulme, suggest that this may have had some truth. The foundation in its early years was dominated by Nuffield's belief in scientific research as the driver of modern society. It funded Jodrell Bank and had a deep interest in atomic energy. However, social science was nonetheless essential to its goals from the start, set out in the foundation's first 5 years plan as to assist the disinterested study of human society and men in society. Though there was one woman trustee, women otherwise appear to have been totally subsumed. The research grants it awarded in its early years have a resonance today. Social status and mobility as influencing or influenced by education, marriage, or occupation. There was a recognition of the importance of place in a study of urban communities in Liverpool, Stepney, and Midlands Market Town, and Oxford. And as early as the 1950s, the social organisation of coloured communities in Britain and the attitudes and reactions of white and coloured people. But the project that links Nuffield most closely to Beveridge was the Rowntree Report on Old Age, published in 1947, to survey and make known the needs of our increasingly elderly population and to create means to meet those needs. It was led by that great sociologist Sebum Rowntree, by then well over 70, who had been a trustee of the Special Areas Trust in the 1930s. His report investigated the relation between the medical and social causes and results of disadvantage in old age, and it quoted Beveridge. "It is dangerous to be in any way lavish to old age until adequate provision has been assured for all those other vital needs, such as the prevention of disease and the adequate nutrition of the young." However, it illuminated the loneliness of the old in the cities, the need for many more small homes and better provision for the long-term sick. And that report was a bestseller too. For the first time, the BMJ wrote, an attempt had been made to discover how old people live and assess their particular needs. There's one further link to Beveridge. In the 1950s, the foundation provided grants to give him the statistical backing to finish his great work on the history of prices and wages, and those grants stopped only with Beveridge's death in 1963. So in one respect, the mechanic and the academic had common ground. An unpublished study by Beveridge and the young Harold Wilson, according to Ben Pimlott, begins with a conversation between Dr. Watson and Sherlock Holmes. "This is indeed a mystery," remarks Watson. "What do you imagine this means?" Holmes replies, "I have no data yet. It is a capital mistake to theorize before one has data. Insensibly, one begins to twist facts to suit theories instead of theories to suit facts." Now, the principles of the Nuffield Foundation remain very similar to Beveridge's fundamental belief, as one historian put it, that the acquisition of data is the bricks and mortar of policy making. And so this year, we set out to return to our original 1943 objectives and to reinterpret them for a time when the rapid acceleration of new trends and disruptive forces, social, demographic, technological and economic, are rapidly bringing new dimensions to issues of social mobility and social exclusion. According to one of our grant holders, the foundation is at its best when it reduces policy complexity to a number of practical, tractable questions, such as what makes the system work better for those it is meant to be working for. So our research agenda now stands on 3 pillars: education and skills, especially quantitative skills, from the earliest years through to the world of work, and the obstacles to educational opportunity at each point of transition. Welfare, especially of children and families, learning difficulties, parenting, and the causes and effects of children growing up in adverse circumstances. And justice, especially the reform of the justice system as it deals with the vulnerable and its critical role underpinning the provision of social justice and safeguarding the rights of the individual in relation to the state. And underpinning all these, how public institutions can make better use of research, evidence and data in order to understand better the needs of those they serve. Nonetheless, at a time when expertise seems to have lost some of its power to convince, the challenge for any research, for all our convening power, remains how to judge if it has any influence. And it is in this context that the Social Mobility Commission plays such an important role. As we've seen this week, it crystallises evidence into narrative. It arrests attention. Its policy implications spring from its encounters with real experience, and its reports are one of the most important conduits for our impact as Nuffield, because in recent reports, the Social Mobility Commission has cited our research on, just to name a few projects, comparisons of spending per pupil, in-work poverty, disadvantage in the under fives, costs and benefits of different teacher training routes, socioeconomic differences in university outcomes. And much of the Social Mobility Commission's work has referred extensively to social policy in a cold climate. Nuffield's funded study from Sir John Hill's Centre for the Analysis of Social Exclusion at William Beveridge's LSE. So in that sense, that odd relationship that linked Nuffield to Beveridge, the private benefactor to the welfare state, continues today. And so I'm delighted to introduce our lecturer tonight, the Right Honourable Alan Milburn, former Secretary of State for Health, Chair of the Social Mobility Commission, fresh, as I said, from their latest report, which has dominated all our headlines this week. His title, Slaying the Five Giants, Past, Present and Future. Alan.
Tim, thank you very much indeed. It's an honour to be here this evening and to give this lecture commemorating the 75th anniversary of the Beveridge Report's publication. As president of the Royal Statistical Society, Beveridge was well aware that the Society is the custodian, not just of good data, but of the good that data can do. My thanks also to Tim, the Nuffield Foundation, which through analysis aims to spread opportunity and well-being in our society. The Social Mobility Commission that I chair shares both organisations' belief that data is, or at least should be, the foundation for the making of good public policy. Would that it was always so. To that end, we've agreed between us to consider the issues I'll be discussing tonight and explore together whether further research is most needed to help address them. All three organisations share a common sense of social purpose, and in that regard, a strong sense of alignment with the subject of tonight's lecture. Tonight I want to talk about the welfare state in its myriad of guises, its past, its present, and perhaps most importantly, its future. I want to make the case that just as it took a hefty dose of radicalism to create an edifice capable of tackling the burning social injustices of that time, we will need to rediscover that spirit of radicalism to deal with the new challenges that now confront us. I will set out some challenges that I believe public policymakers are currently ducking and some proposals for change. It feels like a very appropriate time to do so. This week marks the 75th anniversary of an event that changed our country genuinely for good. It is not often that a publication, still less an official government report, changes history, or for that matter, so stands the test of time. But the Beveridge Report shaped the British post-war settlement. It was the foundation on which the modern welfare state was built. Even the uninspiring title of Social Insurance and Allied Services could not prevent William Beveridge's highly technical and frankly often turgid 300-page report from becoming an instant bestseller. It must be the only white paper in history that people have actually queued to buy. Politicians and newspapers pored over it, Parliament debated it, and largely governments of various descriptions implemented it. It was enormously popular. His introduction and 20-page summary sold an unprecedented 635,000 copies. It even made a profit for the government. Summaries were dropped into Nazi-occupied Europe. It never happened in my day, I can tell you. There has never been anything quite like it. By early 1943, according to Richard Waite, 86% of British people were in favour of its contents. Only 6%, I'd love to know who they were opposed. So what was it that made the opinions of a retired civil servant with, in truth, a somewhat checkered career in journalism, academia and public administration so resonant then and still so resilient now? According to the wonderful Nick Timmins, whose The Five Giants is effectively the official biography of the welfare state in a new edition and available in all good booksellers now, it was in part down to the inspirational rhetoric of Beveridge's report. His prose was truly epic in its phrasing. The road to reconstruction, a revolutionary moment in the world's history, and of course, the slaying of the five giants. Peter Hennessy believes that the genius of the Beveridge Report lay in its mixing of the profound and the populist. The Beveridge Report was published in the middle of the Second World War. Professor Harris, in her wonderful biography, makes the point that, like all shapers of history, Beveridge actually enjoyed a very large slice of luck. As she puts it, the report was published a few days after the Battle of El Alamein, which to many people seemed like a turning point in the war. And Beveridge was fortunate in that his mingled tone of optimism, patriotism, high principle and pragmatism exactly fitted the prevailing popular mood. At its heart, Beveridge promised a break not only from the hardships of war, but of the pre-war period. He sought to design a new system of social security to defeat the social injustices that was such a defining feature of the 1930s. He had one simple target in mind: poverty. The objective was to consign to history the mass unemployment alongside the loathed household means test that had so scarred British society. But his vision for the new system of social insurance that he proposed didn't stop there. In truth, he ranged well beyond his rather limited brief. Instead, he called for what he called three assumptions to be implemented: a new national health service to be made free at the point of use, a new set of children's allowances to support families, and a new determination to fully use the powers of the state to maintain employment and defeat unemployment. His was no partial proposition. It was an holistic, cradle-to-grave social security system involving better health, better education, better housing, better employment, and better benefits. One, of course, that drew on decades of social reform in municipal government, housing, welfare, and then, as Paul Edison puts it, provided the prince's kiss. What had been piecemealed before, Beveridge made whole. In Peter Hennessy's phrase, he turned a patchwork of provision into a quilt. It was, as Beveridge put himself, a very British revolution. In so doing, he captured the spirit of the times. As Professor Harris puts it, clothing the bare bones of these proposals was a highly emotive and eloquent account of Beveridge's vision of the new society that was to emerge in Britain after the war. Having made so many sacrifices, in which so many had lost so much, there was emerging in the mid-40s a shared determination in the country that if victory could be won, the peace that followed should be for the benefit of all. The national mood was fearful but expectant. Change was on the agenda. In due course, it would result in unexpected electoral defeat for Winston Churchill and the Conservatives, and a landslide for Clem Attlee's Labour Party. That determination then found expression in the post-war Labour government's towering achievements: full employment, universal education, and new welfare state. Together, they brought new opportunities to millions of women and men in our country. My generation were the principal beneficiaries. As if that were not enough, the Beveridge Report did something even more profound. It helped recalibrate the relationship between the role of the state and the role of markets in the post-war world. On both sides of the Atlantic, a new consensus was taking shape. the social crises of the 1930s owed their origins, it was agreed, to a deadly combination of market excesses and weak governments. Policymakers felt impelled to devise new means of avoiding a repeat of the deep social and economic injustices that had given birth to the unrestrained and evil populism of the Nazi era. In future, to sustain both democratic political systems and capitalist economic ones, there would have to be a greater sharing of prosperity and opportunity. The political leaders of the 1940s put in place new architecture designed to prevent any repeat of the 1930s. In the US, President Roosevelt had created his New Deal. In the UK, Prime Minister Attlee created the welfare state, using the Beveridge Report as the catalyst for doing so. And for all its deficiencies, it has broadly stood the test of time. It has survived droughts of funding and, especially from the 1980s onwards, seemingly endless bouts of reform. The National Health Service may not be entirely free at the point of use in the way that Beveridge envisaged, but it is almost unique in the world in being a unitary and universal system, largely funded from general taxation and providing care based on the basis of need and not ability to pay. Its sister service, social care, has not rid itself of one of the features that Beveridge targeted, means testing, but over the course of 7 decades, it has coped with ever-increasing demands, although its ability to do so now looks sadly stretched. The basic state pension survived Mrs. Thatcher's breaking of the link with earnings and is, for millions of people, a foundation for their incomes in old age and a platform on which private sources of funding can be built. What is more, the benefit system has been extended over these successive decades to include support for cohorts that fell well outside of Beveridge's consideration. People with disabilities have been one such group. Another is children. In the last 20 years, early years and childcare services have effectively become a new arm of the welfare state. A third, and a far bigger cohort of beneficiaries, has been those who are in work but who need state support to make ends meet. The growth of housing benefits, and particularly in-work benefits, has massively extended the scope of what the modern welfare state does. Over 7 decades, the emphasis in the benefit system has shifted from supporting people on condition that they did not work to supporting them instead to be in work. The downside, from a pure Beveridgeite point of view, is that means testing through tax credits, housing benefit, and now universal credit now extends way up the income scale. More significantly, perhaps, has been the erosion of the contributory principle that sat at the heart of the Beveridge plan. Benefit in return for contributions, rather than free allowances from the state, is what the people of Britain desire. That is what Beveridge declared. Today, the contributory principle has all but disappeared. That has been the subject of regret in some parts of the political spectrum, a matter of necessity in others. The debates over the shape and direction of the welfare state began well before it was born and have raged on ever since. Universality versus targeting, the need to keep the middle class on board versus the fear that sharp elbows have made the middle class too much the beneficiary. The fear, often from the right, that the welfare state had gone too far, the worry from the left that it had not gone nearly far enough. It has been the subject of almost continuous political rancor. In one sense, it is a miracle it has survived, but it has. Today, the welfare state, in its various forms, accounts for around 2/3 of all public spending. The £500 billion or so that we all cough up as taxpayers may not always be well spent, and the services that it provides may not always be as good as they could be. But in large part, the Beveridge plan delivered the goods. Harold Macmillan may have gone too far in claiming that Britain had never had it so good, but the decades following the Second World War saw sustained economic growth and near full employment. Poverty fell, Slums were cleared, schools were built, health improved, incomes rose, inequality fell. What is more, the new welfare state created the platform for the upsurge in social mobility that changed Britain for the better. I have reasons to be grateful. I grew up on a council estate and I was fortunate enough to end up in the UK cabinet. I was born at the right time. The 1950s and the 1960s saw Britain finally emerging from the aftershocks of the war years. It wasn't in any sense a golden age, but the national mood was largely one of optimism. The economy was growing, the role of women in society was changing, social mobility was in full swing. By 1948, the year that I was born, the prospect of a more classless society seemed so within reach that Michael Young wrote his totemic book, The Rise of the Meritocracy, precisely to warn about the downsides of a genuinely meritocratic society. It has become commonplace to deride the Butzkelite political consensus of the post-war years, but in truth, it was a period of unprecedented social success. Counter to today's prevailing anti-politics mood, the fact that Britain made such progress on the most intractable social problems of the age is testament of the ability of our political system to actually deliver. To do so, of course, it has to keep pace with the times. The world doesn't stand still. Today, the welfare state is facing new pressures, and in truth, is struggling to cope. Fiscal austerity has exacted a social price. 75 years after the Beveridge plan to abolish want, we've seen the return of food banks, the modernised equivalent of the old soup kitchens. Homelessness has risen by 10%. You see it in virtually every part of London in just 5 years. It has taken the tragedy of Grenfell Tower and the glaring inequities between rich and poor in one of the wealthiest parts of our nation to put social housing back on the public policy agenda after decades of neglect. Meanwhile, at the top, incomes continue ever upwards. The top 1% share of personal total wealth grew from 17% in 1988 to 22% in 2002. Between 2010 and 2014 alone, over half of the increase in personal wealth went to the top 10% of households in our country. At the bottom, real earnings have been stagnant for 10 years. And as the Chancellor confirmed in his budget last week, we face the prospect of perhaps a further decade of stagnating average earnings. By the way, that is quite unprecedented in our history. The Institute for Fiscal Studies predicts absolute child poverty will rise from 15% to over 18% by the turn of the decade, mainly thanks to benefit changes that will reduce the incomes of the poorest families in the land. Austerity is taking its toll too on our core public services. The NHS, for example, is stuttering. 2 in 3 NHS trusts are in deficit. Waiting time targets have not been hit for almost 2 years. In good part, this is for a very simple reason. It's a mismatch between supply and demand. Since the NHS was formed, it has received an average annual increase in funding of around 3.7%. For the last 9 years or so, that has been about 1.5%. Worse still is the situation in social care, where deep cuts in finances have been accompanied by serious reductions in services and specifically in care home beds. In short, 75 years on from its conception, our ageing welfare state is not really in the rudest of health. Now, it would be all too easy to put all the blame for these problems on austerity, but it has been destabilised by more fundamental longer-term factors too. Let's start with politics. All too often, because of the sheer scale of what Beveridge created, he is thought of as a statist. It pays to remember that, in fact, he was a liberal. The philosophy that sat at the heart of his report was this: the state should offer security for service and contribution. The state, in organising security, should not stifle incentive, opportunity, responsibility. In establishing a national minimum, it should leave room and encouragement for voluntary action by each individual to provide more than the minimum for himself and his family. Unlike in continental Europe, where new social security benefits were earnings related, the Beveridge system was built on the notion of a minimum income guaranteeing subsistence for all while acting as a platform for individual contributions. The deal was simple. The state would discharge its responsibilities so long as the citizen discharged theirs. But his plan was a product of his time. Big national problems were solved with big national institutions. The railways were nationalised, and so were the coal mines. The NHS was formed with a capital N, not, as some proposed, and Nye Bevan in part later regretted, as a municipally run service. The state was king. From the nation's shipyards to its telephone lines, it came to pervade all walks of life. New towns were built, new universities too. New benefits were introduced, new subsidies for all forms of housing were created. State spending on housing, education, health and social security rose by almost 140% in the 1960s alone. With each passing decade, the state grew and the role of the citizen shrank. The deal between them to share responsibility began to unravel. As the state extended its reach, the role of the citizen, whether in cash or in kind, somehow receded. The citizen's responsibility as parents to ensure good behaviour on the part of their children, as patients to look after their own health, as benefit recipients to seek employment and work, increasingly played second fiddle to the states. That made the welfare state easy pickings for the new politics that emerged on the back of the economic crises of the 1970s and the neoliberal ascendancy of the 1980s. Beveridge's plan was predicated on keeping unemployment under control. And it is a remarkable thing that for much of the post-war period, Labour and Conservative governments alike kept the rate of unemployment at around 4%, generally between 100,000 and 300,000 people who were not in work. Indeed, when it rose above 600,000 in 1967, it was deemed a disaster. By the 1980s, of course, it had hit 3 million. Years of underinvestment in the British economy and the impact of globalisation had combined to destroy the full employment ethos of the 50s and the 60s. Billions of pounds were poured into new schemes by successive governments to try to reduce unemployment, so extending the reach of the welfare state still further. Some worked, many failed. But as the economics changed, so did the politics. By the late 70s, the state was coming to be seen as the enemy of the free market, not its friend. As Ronald Reagan so graphically put it, the 9 most terrifying words in the English language are, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." His ideological soulmate, Mrs. Thatcher, made it her mission to roll back the state. Privatisation, not nationalisation, became the order of the day. 2.5 million council homes were sold to tenants as part of her great vision of a home and share-owning democracy. And indeed, the Thatcherite revolution rewarded the aspirations of millions of ordinary working families. Businesses were freed from excessive cost and control. The labour market was liberalised and the trade unions tamed. Pioneering reforms were made in services like education and health to devolve power and create new forms of governance. But the tsunami of radicalism exacted a high social price. Unemployment soared as deindustrialisation bit. The burgeoning welfare state was now viewed as a burden, not a blessing. Benefits were frozen, entitlements were restricted, conditionality was extended. The notion that there is no such thing as society had calamitous consequences for Beveridge's principal target. Child poverty doubled. Inequality rose faster in the UK than anywhere else in the developed world. By the middle of the 90s, it was obvious that the public had had enough. The Blair Revolution brought the state back into play. But this was not the state as we had known it, nor frankly as many in the Labour Party expected. Big rises in public spending, of course, allowed the power of the state to be directed on traditional labour ends. Absolute child poverty fell by almost 2 million kids. Pensioner poverty fell dramatically. Extreme levels of poverty pay were tackled through the introduction for the first time of a statutory minimum wage. Unemployment fell sharply. But the means by which this social progress was made, although often couched in the language of modern, moderate centrism, were actually deeply radical. Access to benefits was tightened, conditionality was strengthened, business taxes were cut, the market was embraced. Reforms in the NHS introduced choice and competition to give ordinary people rights that hitherto only the wealthy could enjoy. In education, schools were freed from local authority control in an attempt to raise attainment of the poorest children. Fees were introduced for higher education to get the middle class contributing to the benefits that a university place conferred upon their children. Each of these changes, in the words of New Labour's constitution, were aimed at redistributing power, wealth, and opportunity in society. The means of creating a fairer society had been modernised, even while the ends remained the same. A new attitudinal landscape accompanied these huge political changes. Beveridge didn't coin the term the welfare state. Indeed, he actively disliked it. His was a social security system. It is a term today that is little used. Welfare has become a pejorative, even abusive part of the political lexicon for many politicians and certainly for some of our newspapers. The collectivism of the 1940s seems to have given way to the divisive distinction some contemporary politicians have made between so-called strivers and so-called shirkers. Public support for benefits for the poor fell from 61% in 1989 to just 27% in 2009. Support for more taxation and public spending also fell from a record 63% in the late 90s to 32% during the recession. Now, it is true, after years of austerity, there are signs of change. Most people now want more taxation, more public spending, and more wealth redistribution. But ours is an informed and inquiring society. Universal education and the internet have redistributed knowledge in society. In a consumer world, people expect services, public as well as private, to be attuned to their needs and capable of offering personal choice. That is a long way from the one-size-fits-all, take-it-or-leave-it model of the 1940s. It is not that the public today expects surgeries or hospitals to behave like supermarkets or sales rooms. The relationship people desire is not merely a transactional one, they want a personal one. The welfare state, however, is struggling to find ways of treating each citizen as an individual rather than just another number. There is a new demographic landscape to contend with too. When Beveridge reported, the worry was not about an aging population, but a declining one. And in his view, it fell to, quote, housewives as mothers to put this right through their vital work in ensuring the active continuation of the British race. A woman's place was in the home, even though in the war years, of course, it had been in the forces, in the factories and on the land. By 1960, women's participation in the labour force had fallen to 38%. Today it is 71%. Successive waves of immigration, from the Windrush 50s through the Asian 70s, and more recently the wave of Eastern European migrants that we have seen, have reshaped Britain in a way that would have been unimaginable for Beveridge. In my view, mainly for the better. Modern Britain is a far more diverse society than Beveridge could have ever envisaged. It's also a far older one. When Beveridge reported, there were less than 250,000 people aged over 85. Today there are 1.5 million. In the last 5 years, the number of over 75s has risen by 500,000. In the next 10 years, there will be 2 million more. A child born today stands a 1 in 3 chance of living to be 100. That is a blessing, but it's also a cost. Indeed, it costs 3 times as much to look after a 75-year-old as it does a 30-year-old. The care system is already struggling to cope with a new form of old age. More very old people living with more comorbidities than we have ever seen before. The pension system is struggling too. The proportion of over 65s compared to people of working age was 22% in the 1960s. It's around 31% and it is changing fast. Faced with these demographic challenges, the state-provided old age pension has long ceased to be the major source of income for the elderly. The baby boomer generation, at least those who were able to work, benefited from final salary employer pension schemes, but they too have been disappearing. For the last 2 decades, successive governments have grappled with how to fill the gap and how critically to encourage the young to save for old age. Auto-enrolment is the most recent and, in my view, welcome answer. Whether it will be enough, only time will tell. But the point is that care and income in old age have once again become a jointly owned responsibility between the individual and the state. There is no going back. In good part, that is because a new social landscape has emerged with a new core challenge to address. From the 1940s onwards, arguably the greatest social policy concern was about one cohort in society, the elderly poor. The focus on poverty and old age, especially during the 1990s and the early 2000s, has changed all that. Of course, there are still poor pensioners, too many of them. But today the elderly are the social group least likely to be at the bottom of the income distribution. It is a remarkable story of social progress. In fact, pensioners today, on average, enjoy higher levels of income than working-age adults. They're more asset-rich too. Unfortunately, there is a reverse side to that coin. There is a new injustice to address: intergenerational unfairness. Those born in the 1980s are the first post-war cohort not to start their working years with higher incomes than their predecessors. Home ownership, the aspiration of successive generations of ordinary people, is in sharp decline, amongst the young especially. Most shocking of all, today only 1 in 8 kids from low-income backgrounds is likely to become a high-income earner as an adult. The 20th century expectation that we were all brought up with, that each generation would do better than the next, than the last, is no longer being met. The great British promise that sat at the heart of Beveridge's report, that successively generations would become wealthier and more prosperous and with more progress, it is a promise that is now being broken. Over recent decades, it has become increasingly obvious that ours as a country, while all too often demography still determines destiny. Over decades, we have become a wealthier society, but we've struggled to become a fairer one. The global financial crisis was a watershed moment. The market excesses of the 1930s found a disturbing echo in the late 1990s. When the crash came, it was not the wealthiest, but those on low and average incomes who paid the price. While the wealthy in society have continued to get far wealthier, average earnings have stagnated. In America, that has been the case for almost 30 years. That is not sustainable, and the chickens are now coming home to roost. Anger is the new currency in society. Populism is its consequence in politics. The history of our continent tells us that when the majority feel they're losing unfairly, while someone else is gaining unfairly, things can turn ugly. Public attitudes to wealth, and particularly to immigration, have changed, and not for the better. The public mood is sour, and decision makers have been far too slow to recognise that untrammeled wealth for a few at the top, growing insecurity for many in the middle, and stalled life chances for those at the bottom is not really a viable social proposition for Britain. The growing sense that we have become an us and them society is deeply corrosive of our cohesion as a nation. The European referendum last year exposed deep divides that go well beyond the box that people crossed. Public concern, even anger, about issues of identity, immigration, and inequality found a voice and a target to aim at. Of the 65 parts of the country my commission identified yesterday as having the worst education and employment prospects in Britain, only 5 areas voted to remain in the European Union. By contrast, of the 65 areas that are best for social mobility, the overwhelming majority voted to remain. Our politics are becoming polarised, just as our country is. At a time when more and more people feel like they're losing out, social mobility can be a rallying point to prove that modern capitalist economies like our own are capable of creating better, fairer, more inclusive societies. In my view, it is the best antidote to the growth of political populism, both of right and of left, that we are witnessing across the world. In my view, it is really the defining issue of our age. In the 40s, the Beveridge Plan was the response to the inequities of the time. A similar scale of response is desperately needed today. Of course, the problems we face in Britain today are different from those the Beveridge system was designed to address. Injustice has not disappeared, but it has taken new forms. So must too the solutions. New thinking and a new approach is necessary. Beveridge was right about one core thing, about the need for big radical change, the slaying of the 5 giants. Tinkering will not do. In my view, 5 what I call giant reforms are needed. The first is in labour market policy. Rightly, for decades, the focus in Britain has been about moving people from welfare to work. A job remains the best safeguard against being poor, but it is not a cure for poverty. It is no coincidence that whereas 2 or 3 decades ago, child poverty was concentrated in workless households, today 2 in 3 children who are officially classified as poor by the government live in a household where at least one parent is in work. Poverty has become the preserve of working people rather than simply the work less, still less the work shy. The assumptions underpinning much of labour market policy for the past few decades have proven wrong. The theory had been that if the state could help enough people get off welfare and into work, the labour market would then do the heavy lifting. But this assumption ignored the new reality of millions of low-paid workers having jobs but not having careers. Today, more people are in poverty in work than those out of work. Over 5 million people in Britain earn less than the voluntary living wage. It is £8.75 per hour. These are the people, by the way, who do the right thing. They stand on their own 2 feet, they strive, they don't shirk, they go out to work, they try to do the best for their families. But they are victims of Britain's endemic low pay trap. Just 1 in 6 people who were on low pay in 2006 had escaped it by 2016. It should come as no surprise that the overwhelming majority are women, mainly young, working part-time and trying to juggle work with family responsibilities. In my view, we've reached an inflection point. Britain's flexible workforce gives us global economic advantage, but a 2-tier labour market is now exacting too high a social price. The British economy is performing very well in terms of employment, with a record 75% of the working age population in work. Beveridge would have been pleased with that, but he would have been dismayed at the fact that 1 in 5 people are on low pay, giving Britain a higher level of low-paid employment than other comparable nations. In our lifetimes, something profound has happened in the labour market. There has been a decoupling of economic growth from wage growth at the bottom end of the labour market especially. Since the 1970s, technological change has been skills biased. People with higher skills have seen large increases in productivity and pay, while those with lower skills have experienced reduced demand for labour and lower average earnings. In most developed countries, there's been a declining share of economic growth going to labour and a higher share going to capital. Wage inequality has got ever wider. In the UK, the share of national income going to wages in the bottom half of the earnings distribution fell by a quarter between 1970 and 2009. Over the recent decades, the state has increasingly stepped in to subsidise stagnating earnings and prop up living standards. Tax credits today now cost close to £30 billion a year. We're paying for that. Austerity removes that prop. The taxpayer is now struggling to shoulder the burden of bridging the gap between earnings and prices. In any case, across the political spectrum, more and more questions are rightly being asked about a system in which half of all families with children have their income supplemented by the state, even though they're in work, to compensate for employers simply not paying their staff enough to live on. So with new demands, an ageing population especially, creating pressures on the welfare state and its spending, the burden for bridging the gap between earnings and prices will in future have to be more evenly shared between government and business. The welcome introduction of a living wage by George Osborne is a good first step, but it cannot stop there. Of course, simply increasing pay cannot be done without improvements in productivity. That will require a much more active labour market approach and a closer partnership between government and employers than we have seen over recent years. A transparent concordat between the state and business is long overdue, where government is clear with employers what their social obligations will be and in turn what it will contribute. Moving people from low pay to living pay has to be a jointly owned responsibility between the state and the market. That brings me to the second change in education and employability policy. Britain's low pay problem is largely a low skills problem. The fact that skill shortages have risen by over 130% since 2011 is the best evidence that the current system is simply not working. A radical overhaul is needed. This starts with what happens in schools and the early years to ensure that every child is equipped with both the academic and critically the personal skills needed for success in the modern labour market. As technological change picks up speed, it could de-skill ever higher numbers of today's jobs. Within decades, the Bank of England has suggested that up to 15 million current jobs risk automation. If current trends continue, the Local Government Association suggests that by 2022, there could be 9 million low-skilled people chasing around 4 million jobs, with a shortage of 3 million high-skilled workers to fill the estimated 15 million high-skilled jobs by then available. As our economy becomes ever more reliant on higher levels of skill, education will become ever more the key that unlocks social mobility. Study after study has come to the same conclusion. Time spent in education, including the vital early years, is the most important determinant of future social status, and success at school is the most important factor determining mobility. Over decades, standards have risen in our schools, but there is a long tail of underachievement that is failing to realise the innate potential of huge numbers of youngsters. Around 1 in 3 children on free school meals, the poorest sixth in society, get good exam results at age 16, compared to 2 in 3 of all other children. This is not innate, by the way. Low ability children from wealthy families overtake high ability children from poor families during primary school. Despite some recent success, most notably in London state schools, in narrowing the gap in educational attainment between poorer children and their better-off classmates, the deep-seated social gradient in how well children do in school has not been flattened. From the early years, through schools and on to universities, there's an entrenched and unbroken correlation between social class and educational success. The income gap is larger than either the ethnicity gap or the gender gap in schools. In my view, it is time to put the ending of that profound unfairness at the heart of our country's education policy. The government should set clear objectives for doing so, and it should commit to a redistribution of education resources to those areas that need them most. A child living in one of England's most disadvantaged areas today is 27 times more likely to go to an inadequate school than a child living in a wealthy area. Since the global evidence points to the quality of teaching being the key factor in helping close this attainment gap, the government should find new ways of giving the best teachers better incentives, including higher pay, to teach in the most challenging schools. Nor, however, is this a job for the state alone. In the end, the biggest influences on children's life chances are not schools or universities or childcare centres, still less governments. They're parents. 2 in 5 of children from the poorest families are read to every day, compared to nearly 4 in 5 of those from the wealthiest families, with consequences that are felt throughout that child's life. More support is needed to bridge that parenting gap because it is so crucial to closing the life chances gap. More is also needed to make Britain as strong in vocational education as we proudly are in higher education. For decades, the latter has taken more of the resources and, frankly, more of the focus of public policy than the former. That needs to change. Just 18% of Britain's working population has a post-secondary school non-degree qualification. In Germany, it is 59%. In today's skill-based global economy, Britain is fighting with one hand tied behind our backs. Too many courses simply lead to low-paid work in low-skilled sectors of the economy. Apprenticeship numbers are falling, especially among young people. They're often of dubious quality, and most are in low-skilled sectors with little chance for progression. My commission believes that apprenticeships need to be refocused on careers with good prospects for progression, and we should address the fact that unlike other developed countries, Britain currently has no comprehensive vocational education and training programme for low-paid workers with low or no qualifications who want a second chance later in life. The rhetoric of lifelong learning in a fast-changing world needs to be made reality. Third, a fundamental rethink is needed in spatial and in regional policy. It has long been assumed that Britain could get by with unbalanced economic growth. In London, the number of top-end professional jobs has increased by around 750,000 in the last 10 years. In the West Midlands by 140,000, in the North East by under 60,000. At the other end of the labour market, there are 40 local authority areas where 1 in 3 jobs are paid below the living wage. Over decades, a quiet new assumption has come to underpin public policy thinking that people from weaker economic areas who want to get on would have to move out. Limited education and employment opportunities in many urban and rural communities have forced aspirational youngsters to heed Norman Tebbett's advice, to get on their bikes in order to get ahead. As our annual report published yesterday highlights, there is a new geography of disadvantage in Britain that transcends any simple north-south divide. Towns like Great Yarmouth and Minehead have as poor prospects as Blackpool or Mansfield. Our analysis reveals a growing gulf between our country's great cities, London especially, and the towns and counties elsewhere in the country that are being left behind economically and hollowed out socially. Modern Britain has at its core a stark social mobility postcode lottery where the chances of someone from a disadvantaged background getting on is closely linked to where they grew up and where they live. The consequences are felt increasingly too in an unaffordable London housing market. A less divided Britain will require a more redistributive approach to spreading education and employment prospects across our country. That will mean rebalancing public spending so that more of the transport and education budgets are targeted at the towns and counties of left-behind Britain. It would also entail the government working with large employers and devolving more power to local councils to bring new high-quality job opportunities backed by financial incentives to these social mobility cold spots. In our view, the government should set clear objectives for doing so and should report annually to demonstrate its progress. Fourth, a new approach in the housing market is also needed to close the gap between the housing haves and have-nots. There is a housing crisis in Britain today, which spans social housing, the private rented sector, and owner occupation. A housing plan is needed to address it. Let's start with the private rented sector. It has overtaken social housing to become the second biggest tenure in England. Across our country, the proportion of private renters nearly doubled between 2003 and 2015. Renting used to be a transitional sector, mainly used by single people or couples without kids. Today, families with children are the most common type of household in private rented accommodation. They often find themselves in poor quality housing with low security of tenure. Tenants can end up moving frequently, so destabilising schooling and family life. Ironically, it also costs more to rent than it does to buy. Private tenants pay a higher proportion of their income on housing than those in any other tenure, and that proportion has been steadily rising over time. This free market approach has also had consequences for the taxpayer. The housing benefit bill has gone through the roof. It rose from around £3 billion in the late 70s to nearly £24 billion last year. Government has slowly and welcomely started to intervene in the market, but much more will be needed. My Commission has proposed that it should use tax incentives and regulatory powers to ensure that over a 10-year period, more affordable, longer-term tenancies become the norm in the private rented sector. The shape of social housing has also changed fundamentally in these last few decades. Housing associations are now the biggest providers, no longer local authorities, but the number of homes being built is simply not keeping pace with demand. Today, over 1 million people are on local authority housing waiting lists. Last year, 50,000 social homes were built in this country. So it is welcome that housing associations are being incentivised to build more homes and that the government has committed to get local councils building again. But words need to be matched by deeds. And at a time when the cost of capital is low and there is a wall of liquidity that, in a way that the world has never seen, the government should rethink its fiscal plans and make it a priority to borrow to invest in the nation's social housing infrastructure. People who own their own homes, of course, have average non-pension wealth of over £300,000, compared to less than £20,000 for social and private tenants. Closing that gap requires more people to get on the home ownership ladder. Unfortunately, the reverse is happening. The long-held assumption that a free market approach which matches supply with demand is simply not working. Owner occupation, one of the foundations for higher levels of social mobility, has fallen by 17% in the last decade amongst the under 44s, as their household incomes have grown at only half the rate of their housing costs. Today's young generation is more reliant than ever on their parents for help to buy their own home. 3 times as many buyers are using inherited funds to do so now than they were just a decade ago. Changing that will require more radical action on housing supply and on planning policy. If the government's ambition to have 300,000 homes built a year is to be achieved, it will have to intervene more actively in the house building market, particularly to break the cartel of the major house builders. It will have to allow selective building on greenbelt land, and it will have to enable councils to be able to build for sale and not just for rent. Fifth and finally, our care and welfare systems will need to be transformed to cope with changes both in disease and in demography. In health, If the biggest challenge of the last century was to beat infectious disease, the battle for this century is all about chronic disease. It already absorbs 75% of NHS spending, but as rates of diabetes, arthritis, and dementia grow, it too will increase. What differentiates chronic disease from other forms of illness is that it becomes a permanent fixture of people's lives. It is with them 24/7. So what patients do to manage their own condition, their lifestyle, their diet, their exercise, is as important as what clinicians do. The challenge is to find ways of treating patients less as passive recipients of care in a system that denies them both power and responsibility, and instead empowers them to take greater charge and more responsibility for their own health. Fortunately, technology is now giving people the tools to do so. The world is on the verge of a huge leap forward in how healthcare is delivered. Indeed, if the benefits of genetic science and pharmacogenetics can be realized, the next few decades could see our whole model of healthcare moving from one that has been about detecting and then treating illness to one that instead predicts and prevents ill health. That will mean redesigning the care system away from its 20th century focus on episodic treatment, largely in hospitals, towards earlier preventative action and continuity in treatment, first in the community and then as telecare and telemedicine technology evolves into people's homes. In turn, that will require new financial incentives that operate across the whole care system to help keep patients healthy and out of hospital. It will mean new accountable care organisations, integrating health and social care around the needs of individual patients. And above all, it will mean changing the balance of power in the care system so that patients have more choice and more control over their own care. One means of doing so is for people with chronic disease to be offered their own state-funded budgets so they can buy the care that is right for them and personalised to their needs. Evidence from this country, as well as the US and Germany, is that personal budgets manage to increase levels of user satisfaction and at the same time decrease levels of public spending. Over the next decade, they should become the norm for millions of citizens. Older people should be the principal beneficiaries. Over decades, the notion of the state providing care from cradle to grave has been eroded. Older people nowadays are means tested if they require domiciliary or residential care. Local authorities, faced with cuts to social services budgets, have had little option other than to make eligibility criteria for public funding more and more tight. The balance between what the state contributes and what the individual or their family contributes has swung heavily to the latter and away from the former. These changes have been covert rather than overt and have given rise to widespread confusion and concern. Nonetheless, two things are now clear. The state cannot afford to pay for all the care costs of old age, and the current system is not sustainable. As the Conservative Party found during this year's election campaign, however, reform here is fraught with political risk. Equally, muddling through is not a sustainable option. A fresh start is what is needed. Ideally, the political parties would align around some core elements of a new system. That the state has an obligation to ensure that no pensioner should live in poverty, that some of the current spending on old age benefits for better off pensioners is switched to old age care for less well-off ones, that the state should invest more in elderly care, but so too must the individual, that new mechanisms to release the equity tied up in people's houses are key to making individual contributions more affordable. These could be foundations for reform. They would take time to build and, of course, courage to implement. But they could be the means of making Beveridge's contributory principle relevant to the modern age. Similar principles will need to be applied to making the pension system sustainable. By 2030, 1/5 of the UK population will be elderly. the state cannot afford to pay for all of their financial support in old age. The existing old age pension, of course, will and should continue, but individuals will have to do more saving themselves to foot their costs when they retire. For decades, successive governments have tried to find new ways of encouraging saving. Some policies, like the ISA, have been successful, but in truth, we are in the foothills of the journey to make saving a mass market, mainly through what happens in the workplace. The contribution that workers are making for their old age right now are very low, but will have to rise if their retirements are to be financially comfortable. That is no easy task, not least because the young never really believe that they're going to be old. It seems inevitable to me that the current voluntary system of savings that is being introduced into workplaces will have to give way to a compulsory one. When that happens, and how it happens, is of course open to debate, but the costs of old age will in future have to be a partnership between the state and civil society. So, what I have called these 5 reforms have a common core purpose: to provide security in a world which feels increasingly insecure. People need to know in a globalized economy that if you work, it always pays and does not condemn you to poverty. That in a world of rapid technological change, the education and skills system will lift you up, not keep you down. That even as Britain glories in London's status as a global capital, opportunities to progress are available in all parts of our nation. That whatever your form of housing tenure, you should be able to choose a secure, good quality, affordable home. That in an ageing society, the care and welfare system will help look after you and help you to look after yourself. This may well feel like a long way from the nationalised industry model that the welfare state became. Meeting today's challenges, confronting the modern welfare state in its myriad of guises, calls for a rekindling of Beveridge's original vision of a partnership between the state and the citizen. Whether it is improving health or tackling crime, regenerating communities or beating poverty, we need active states, of course, but we also need active citizens. Of course, state action to create jobs and end poverty pay is essential. Governments that are determined to close the attainment gap in schools and build more homes can help to address Britain's deep and growing social mobility problem. But in the end, social mobility isn't something that can be given to people. It has to be earned through their endeavour, their commitment, and their hard work. Meeting these challenges will require more than a new determination to redistribute income. It will need the redistribution of opportunity, and it will need the redistribution of power. I hope that Beveridge would approve of that. Even if some of the individual propositions I've made tonight would not gain his approval, the notion that grasping the nettle of change is the test that public policy has to pass would, I am sure, feel very familiar to him. In a world today where the challenges feel big, but modern politics all too often acts small, the time has come for politicians to rediscover a core sense of purpose and of possibility. Professor Harris says in the final words of her book that Beveridge's favourite quotation from Sophocles' Antigone was this: "When I have ceased to hanker after the impossible, I shall have ceased to breathe." Our country has good reason to thank William Beveridge for believing that big change was possible. For all its faults, the welfare state made our country more kind and more fair. The job of this generation of policymakers is to reinvent it for the new century in which we live. That can only be done by rekindling the spirit of radicalism that the Beveridge plan so epitomised all those years ago. Thank you very much for listening.
Well, many thanks for that great and thoroughly well-deserved round of applause. It was a really fascinating lecture. Thank you very, very much. It was one that really conveyed the extent to which the report was responsible for transforming tens of millions of people's lives. And I hope that it's one that's going to inspire us to ask the right questions and come up with the right answers so that our generation too can tackle the 5 giants which still bedevil our society. So talking of questions and answers, I know that, Alan, that you very kindly said that you will take some questions from the audience here this evening. There will be some roving mics going around very shortly. I'd quite like to take the opportunity to ask a question whilst I'm stood here, because I was born in the 1980s. So what you were saying about the intergenerational fairness really resonated with me, and I was wondering, how do you think we can address some of these intergenerational issues when the people that have already benefited the most from the Beveridge Report are going to be those individuals who are going to need greater care in their older life? As you said, we've got a greater life expectancy and the chronic illnesses. We've already got this intergenerational unfairness. How are we going to tackle that going forward?
Well, Beveridge understood one thing. The change always begins with an argument. If you read the 20-page introduction, it's basically an extended argument. That's what it is. So I'm afraid we're going to have an argument. And data will help us in this regard. So I think, nowadays, for a whole variety of reasons, politics is it's a difficult skill in a world where everybody has an opinion. Everybody's got the tools to have an opinion. It's different even from my day, frankly. Twitter hadn't been born in the late 1990s, Chris, thank God. And so everybody's got an opinion, so it's just much harder. You face a tsunami of opinions coming at you all the time. But unfortunately, the only way to counter argument is with argument. So it begins with argument, it begins with philosophy, it begins with purpose. And I actually believe that although on occasions the public can look as though they're deeply irrational, by and large, people, when presented with the facts, behave quite rationally. Okay? And I also believe that, it's why I'm probably more on the left than I am on the right. I also sort of believe that innate in our being is that, we are social animals, and overwhelmingly the people are good, not bad. That might be wrong. I hope it isn't. And just because you're a beneficiary of something doesn't mean that you don't want for others what you've had for yourself. And so, if you're in a conversation with older people about the prospects of their grandchildren, they're pretty worried right now. They're worried about how they're going to pay their tuition fees. They're worried about debts that they come out of university with. They're worried about being able to get on the housing ladder. They're worried about their incomes. They're worried about graduates not being in graduate jobs. They're worried about all sorts of things. So I think there's a well of worry in the country. Unfortunately, I don't think that has been quite captured in the way that it might have been done by the political class. To make social mobility I think it's the defining issue of the age. I'm not sure that that's necessarily shared in the political class as a whole. But something has to give here. We can't just keep doing what we're doing. It's a good idea to learn from history rather than just living in it or repeating it. And some of these big divides that are now taking place, which are not just intergenerational, as we were reporting yesterday, they're geographic as well. They're social. And I think in the end that people have whatever their point of view about politics, they have a sense of discomfort that the country is becoming less cohesive and more divided. And I think there is a yawning chasm right now in British politics for somebody to step in and explain that, and also explain, as Beveridge did, how that gap can be closed. I don't know where that's coming from, by the way, but I'm ever hopeful.
So I'd like to give you the opportunity to put questions to Alan. So there will be some mics coming around. If you'd like to ask a question, please put your hand up and wait for a mic to come to you. And if I could ask you to just introduce yourselves before you ask a question, that would be great. So if we just go here to start off with. Thanks, Max.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. My name is Max. I work at an organisation called Sense About Science. You spoke about a mood of anti-politics, I think, at one point in your talk. So I just want, and I think it's connected to a lot of what you're saying, but specifically that mood that politicians maybe aren't up to the task, that there are challenges which they're not facing. Where do you think that mood has come from? What's the cause of this anti-politics mood, if it exists? And do you have notions as to how it might be fixed, this relationship between the public and politicians?
I'm going to let you into a secret. Politicians have never been popular. You know, if anybody goes into politics expecting a standing ovation, you can forget it. Occasionally you get a polite round of applause. That's about the extent of it. I think it is there's no doubt that there is a deep sense of political alienation in many parts of the country, at least. And I think that comes from a variety for a number of reasons. Some big structural reasons, first of all, that in a sense, globalization didn't really exist in Beveridge's day. The nation state could do these big tasks because it was able to do so. Economies were closed rather than open. And that has changed. The power of the nation state has diminished over time. So the ability of politics to do what people might expect it to do is sort of diminished or at least changed, first of all. Secondly, however, I do think that there is, and this is where this Brexit thing, I think, is so corrosive. I've got my views on Brexit. I think it was a terrible decision. I still think it's a terrible decision. But the real thing that it has done today is it's put the political class as a whole in fear of the public. That's what's happening. Parliament no more believes in Brexit today than it did in 2016. But it's just overwhelmingly voted for Article 50. On all sides. These guys don't believe it. They don't believe it. Now, I know why they're doing it, because they're under pressure. And until you've been in it, it's quite hard to understand what that feels like. So I understand it, but it's wrong, because it's inauthentic. And the consequence is that they'll get found out. And that's the worst place to be, by the way, in politics. To say one thing when you actually mean another. So the politicians have got to get over the fear. And there are maybe some good reasons to be fearful when you read some of the stuff that people write about you on Twitter and all these things. So I think that is a huge problem. I think the third factor is which is a bit of what we were doing yesterday in this report. When we were looking at the correlation between the Brexit vote and the sense of alienation in many of these communities. And the problem with the political class, and I guess I'm part of it, so I'm going to sort of blame myself too here, is that we are the equivalent of the West Coast liberal in the United States. We sort of live in our own little bubble. Okay, so we live in this swathe or that swathe of America. Unfortunately, the majority sits somewhere in the middle. Okay, and the West Coast liberal, like the metropolitan liberal here, continually rail against the idea that the American public could have possibly been so irrational as to vote for President Trump, or so irrational as to possibly vote for Brexit. And what I was trying to say yesterday when I was doing a press conference, and it's slightly come out oddly in some of the papers today, is that it's actually not irrational. If you've had 30 years of your wages that have been frozen in real terms, okay, and you see others doing remarkably well in a country where the promise is that everyone will do well, guess what? You're going to feel pretty alienated. And you're going to feel a growing sense of resentment. And the stupidity, frankly, of David Cameron in offering the referendum was to provide a vehicle on which all those resentments and alienations could be loaded. Yeah?
Of course, lots of people voted in the referendum for Brexit because they didn't like Europe, they wanted sovereignty and all of those things. Many people voted for those reasons. But there's also some structural reasons behind Brexit. And I categorize them as the 3 I's about identity, loss of identity, rising immigration, that's an issue that people really feel, and social inequality. And what people feel is that the political class hasn't dealt with those issues. Okay? And if you look at what's happening in global politics today, change is the currency. It's not just in the UK. Don't be an incumbent in politics today. Don't be, even Mrs. Merkel. Don't be an incumbent. Be an insurgent. And isn't it interesting that, let me give you 3 examples of insurgency. President Trump, Emmanuel Macron, and Jeremy Corbyn. Right, center, left. Okay? All are consummate insiders. Jeremy's been a bloody MP for 40 years. Emmanuel is a former Rothschild's banker. President Trump is a billionaire. What did they all do? They all presented themselves as outsiders, not insiders. Why? Because those inside that part of the world, the metropolitan elites, are deemed to have failed. What people now want is they want insurgency and change. That's what's happening. And if politics positions itself as about incumbency and about the status quo, it is done for. And my real worry, when I see what is happening in some parts of Europe and beyond, is that insurgency isn't the property of the mainstream in politics. It's becoming the property of the extremes, whether that is the hard left or the far right. So there's a real challenge for politics. Now, all of that is pretty pessimistic and so on. What I actually believe is that, politics abhors a vacuum just as nature does. And this will not go on like this. It really won't. And mainstream politics will have to lean in to tackle these challenges, largely because, if you think of this is not the right analogy, but if you thought of politics as a marketplace, supply and demand, okay? Here's the really odd thing. In the last general election, the 2 big parties, the Conservative Party and the Labour Party, garnered a higher share of the vote than at any time in 45 or 50 years. Okay? The centre basically collapsed. So you've got 2 offers. You've got a sort of, what I crudely call a sort of right-wing nationalism, Brexit, or a left-wing statism, Corbyn. Okay? This is what you had. So people voted for it. Now, do people really believe that that's what the public want? Well, I read the British Social Attitude Survey, which is a wonderful, wonderful report that comes out every year, amazing document. It's really interesting where social attitudes really are. So what do the public want? Yeah, they want some modest redistribution, they want a bit more public spending, they want the end of austerity. Take for Jeremy Corbyn. They also want to deal with immigration as an issue. They also want toughness on law, crime, disorder, and defence. Take for Theresa May. So somewhere, the public are in the middle. The problem is that the politics are not. So if this was a marketplace and there was a demand, you would expect there to be supply. I don't know how that's going to happen or whether it will. But what I do know is that it can't go on like this.
We are running behind
Yeah, sorry, that was
time,
an incredibly long-winded answer. I'm very sorry.
Maybe time for one more question. I'm just going to go to that gentleman there. If you'd like to just wait for the mic to come. Thank you.
Thanks for your talk, Jeff Evans. I guess that the idea of identity has fragmented tremendously since Beveridge, or even in the last 30 years. What are the consequences for that fragmentation into 12 different dimensions or whatever it might be? What are the consequences of that for your ideas of social mobility or the work of your organization?
Well, I think it's a really interesting and difficult question. I don't know where you're from, sir. You're from?
I'm from Finsbury Park.
Yeah. Yeah, okay, very good. Okay, you're a global citizen, which means you're a citizen of nowhere, apparently. But originally, where are you from?
Canada.
Canada, right, okay. Well, I'm not going to make the mistake then of calling you an American. But I read a really interesting book about America the other day called The Death of the American Dream. I don't know if anybody's read it. It's an amazing book. It's really interesting. It's about identity. And it asks a really interesting series of questions about people from different cohorts with different identities in society. It asks white people, it asks African Americans, and it asks Latinos. Some very simple questions about what they think their prospects are for themselves and their children. And these are very similar cohorts from very similar backgrounds, very similar locations, and they get very different answers. So by and large, the white community thinks that it's going nowhere. The white working class probably thinks it's going backwards, not forwards. African Americans, broadly, relatively optimistic. Latinos think their time has come. Identity is imposing a different prism on what America is thinking of itself. Now, overwhelmingly, I think that having a more diverse society, whether it's the US or the UK, is a great thing. Diversity brings economic strength, it certainly brings different forms of social benefits, but it is a challenge for politics. You know, people nowadays are, you know, they're much more emotional and sometimes less rational based upon concepts of identity. You can see that happening in continental Europe right now. Think about what's happening in Spain. So politics has to be able to deal with these challenges. I mean, in the end, I think that what unites different identities, however, is a shared sense of purpose and of values. I mean, there is something very powerful and inherent in the British psyche about fairness. You know, we just think as a country that, you know, we play cricket, don't we? You know, everything should be cricket. I mean, we're terrible at it, by the way, but, you know, we think that things should be fair. And that is a concept, I think, that is, it's not unique to any identity. It crosses all identities, it crosses all generations. And really the job of politics is to be able to capture that in a way that gives it meaning, gives it purpose, but also gives it possibility. And just back to Beveridge as a final concept, the wonderful thing that he did was took a great concept, fairness, equity, tackling poverty and injustice. He made it into a philosophy, but he made it into a concrete set of policies and changes that people could understand and relate to. And in one sense, I don't think the science of public policy making or of politics, despite the growth of identity politics, has really changed. That is still the science. That should still be the purpose of what it is about. You know, in the end, although a lot of the stuff that I quote, you know, may make an audience feel a bit pessimistic, I'm an optimist. Believe me, if you've been in politics, you've got to be pretty optimistic. I'm an optimist because I think some of these things are just going to have to change. There's going to have to be the social change that Beveridge talked about and that I was trying to address today.
Unfortunately, I think we're going to have to leave it there. I'm sure we could have gone on for many more hours. I'd just like to, as a final, just invite our President, Sir David Spiegelhalter, up just to give the final thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, Jen. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I'll be as quick as possible. My name's David Spiegelhalter. I'm on the list along with everybody else there. I'm the current president, and it's my great pleasure to, as quickly as possible, to say thank you to everyone for this evening, for this event on the Beveridge Report, 75 years on. And of course, I've got to start by thanking Alan for that wonderful talk, our distinguished lecturer. I actually find it was really moving. I don't know about you. I'm of the age who benefited massively from Beveridge. I'm a huge beneficiary. I find this very powerful indeed. And a lecture that takes us from El Alamein in 1942. I mean, this report was commissioned in June 1941, the height of the Blitz. What was happening? The bombs were dropping. This place was, London was burning, and they were saying, well, how are we going to reconstruct? I mean, these are extraordinary people who are around then. I think what Alan was saying is that we need some of that extraordinary insight and courage now in today's battles against our five giants, whether it's in Mansfield, Minehead, or of course Grenfell Towers. And I'd also like to thank the Nuffield Foundation, Tim, for introducing this and giving us a wonderful insight into these two different people in Oxford at the same time. Quite extraordinary, just to think of them being so far apart. I wonder if they ever met. Maybe William Morris mended Beveridge's bicycle at one point. And many thanks to Jen Rogers, our esteemed Vice President, for her opening remarks and hosting this all very well. Yes, actually Jen's great. On our Council does so much for the society, representing us in so many activities. And thanks to everybody for coming along. End of a long day. And thanks in particular for Professor Harris, Beveridge's esteemed biographer, for being here. A real honour to have you all here. So if this is the first RSS event you've attended, thank you very much for coming. Please do come again. Please join. There's information on the seats about all our activities. And so just to finish off, thank you again, Alan Milburn. It's been a real pleasure. I think everybody finds this. It's very powerful indeed, these messages. And I do hope that your lecture gets out there and that people take real notice of it. Our friends and partners, the Nuffield Foundation, and all of you for coming along. And finally, downstairs in the council chamber, there's some refreshments, and I hate to say it, beverages for you all. So thank you very much indeed. Thank you.